para wakil dekan, Bapak Dr. Ben Murtah, so thank you for coming. Para guru besar Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Pajajaran, Ketua dan Sekretaris Senat, para pejabat pengelola, mitra kerjasama, Ketua BEM Fakultas Ilmu Budaya, para dosen, tenaga kependidikan dan mahasiswa Fakultas Ilmu Budaya, Ketua dan anggota Dharma Wanita, serta para undangan yang saya muliakan. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, selamat siang dan salam sehat untuk kita semua. Pertama, puji dan syukur kita panjatkan kehadirat Ilahi Robi yang senantiasa melimpahkan rahmat dan karunia-Nya, sehingga pada hari ini kita dapat berkumpul pada acara Puncak Dies Natalies yang ke-66 Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Pajajaran. Terima kasih dan penghargaan kami sampaikan kepada Rektor Universitas Pajajaran, Profesor Dr. Arif S. Kartasisma SPMK, MKS PhD, dan Profesor Dr. Andes Yandian Muhammad Yani MAIR PhD, dan seluruh jajarannya atas segala dukungannya sehingga acara pada hari ini dapat terselenggara dengan baik. Secara khusus kami mengucapkan terima kasih kepada Dr. Ben Murtah dari SOAS London yang sudah bersedia dengan sedikit paksaan untuk menyampaikan orasi ilmiah pada puncak acara peringatan Dies ke-66 FIB Unpad ini. Sekali lagi saya mohon maaf karena tidak dapat hadir pada pagi hari tadi karena saya sakit. Terima kasih atas doa yang sudah disampaikan kepada saya. Sekarang saya mohon izin untuk meminta Ibu Wakil Dekan untuk meneruskan membacakan pidatonya.
Terima kasih. Ya. Kita doakan mudah-mudahan Ibu Dekan segera sembuh. Amin. Saya akan melanjutkan pidato tahunan Dekan yang sudah dibuat oleh Ibu Dekan. Dies Natalies ke-77 FIB Unpad kali ini bertema budaya lokal untuk dunia dengan tagline Rampak Dina Lampah Nyurup Dina Laku yang merupakan bagian dari manifestasi komitmen FIB Unpad untuk berkontribusi dalam usaha meningkatkan ranking Unpad menuju 300 dunia. Unpad pada tahun ini telah mencapai kenaikan berarti dalam perankingan dunia dan kini berada di posisi 596 dunia. Orasi ilmiah Bapak Dr. Ben Murtah berjudul Indonesian Studies from Global Perspective. Saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih sekali lagi karena kesediaannya untuk berbagi. Pak Ben, begitu biasa kami memanggil, secara aktif berkontribusi dalam kegiatan akademik FIB selama ini, baik sebagai narasumber, guest lecture, maupun sebagai bagian dari tim promotor. Hadirin yang saya hormati, tema Dies kita kali ini juga menunjukkan tekad kita sebagaimana diamanahkan oleh Rektor Unpad yang baru untuk menjadikan FIB sebagai pusat budaya yang fungsinya bukan saja berpartisipasi aktif dan berkontribusi dalam pelanggengan budaya, melainkan juga dalam meningkatkan diskusi dan investigasi kritis terhadap budaya sebagai bagian dari identitas Fakultas Ilmu Budaya. Tugas kita akan segera dieksekusi dalam bentuk penghadiran seni pertunjukan secara rutin di kampus sebagai bagian dari kegiatan akademik. Saya bersyukur dan berterima kasih karena antusiasme luar biasa yang ditunjukkan oleh para pengelola, dosen dan mahasiswa untuk melaksanakan hal ini. Rangkaian seni pertunjukan ini akan dimulai tanggal 14 November 2024 di Balai Santika dengan bertajuk Gelaring Pidangan Rineksa Seni FIB Unpad. Budaya lokal di Indonesia mewakili kekayaan tradisi, bahasa, dan praktik yang merupakan bagian integral dari identitas bangsa. Namun, pelestarian dan apresiasi keanekaragaman budaya menghadapi tantangan besar dalam konteks globalisasi dan modernisasi. Sebagai fakultas yang melabeli diri sebagai ilmu budaya, penting bagi kita untuk mengkaji secara kritis pentingnya budaya lokal di Indonesia, ancaman yang dihadapi, dan strategi yang diterapkan untuk mendorong pelestarian dan apresiasi budaya. Moto Indonesia Bhinneka Tunggal Ika merangkum komitmen bangsa untuk melestarikan warisan budaya yang beragam. Pendidikan memainkan peran penting dalam upaya ini karena berfungsi sebagai platform untuk menyebarkan pengetahuan budaya lokal. Sangatlah penting untuk mengintegrasikan, memasukkan budaya lokal ke dalam kurikulum pendidikan untuk menumbuhkan rasa identitas nasional dan persatuan di kalangan generasi muda. Integrasi budaya lokal ke dalam kerangka pendidikan tidak hanya meningkatkan kesadaran budaya tetapi juga memberdayakan siswa untuk bangga terhadap warisan budaya mereka. Hadirin yang saya hormati, Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Padjadjaran terus berupaya untuk meningkatkan rekognisi internasional. Hal ini sejalan dengan tujuan atau agenda Universitas Padjadjaran yang masuk ke dalam 300 besar QSWUR. Sejalan dengan langkah yang secara dinamis dan komitmen kuat Unpad untuk menjadi universitas dunia, FIB juga terus meningkatkan daya saingnya. Kami sangat memohon dukungan Ibu dan Bapak semua untuk dapat hadir dan mendukung setiap proses yang harus dilalui, terutama karena kita akan segera menghadapi proses akreditasi internasional yang kini sudah semakin dekat. Mohon partisipasi Ibu dan Bapak dalam setiap tahapannya. Ibu dan Bapak serta mahasiswa yang saya banggakan, dosen FIB saat ini berjumlah 115 orang, pegawai negeri 102 orang, dosen tetap non-PNS 11 orang, CPNS 2 orang, berdasarkan jenjang pendidikan dosen yang berpendidikan S3 sebanyak 70 orang atau 60,86%, jenjang S2 45 orang 39,13%, dosen berdasarkan jabatan fungsional terdiri atas 8 orang 9,96%. Lektor kepala 35 orang, 30,43%, lektor 61 orang, 53,04%, asisten ahli 6 orang, 5,22%, dan dosen 5 orang atau 4,35%. Dosen yang sedang melaksanakan tugas belajar sebanyak 3 orang, izin belajar 14 orang. Tenaga kependidikan berjumlah 49 orang, 44 orang pegawai negeri dan 5 orang pegawai tetap non-PNS. Dengan jenjang pendidikan S2 4 orang, S1 14 orang dan lainnya 31 orang. Secara presentasi kita sudah mencapai dosen S3 60%, tetapi itu ada di ranah minimal kecukupan. Kita masih harus mendukung agar sejawat dosen dapat segera menyelesaikan studi doktoralnya. Dosen yang pendidikan S3 diharapkan dapat menjadi motor untuk meningkatkan kinerja riset dan publikasi kita yang tidak lagi hanya berfokus pada angka, melainkan lebih kepada dampak. Kita sudah menerapkan berbagai mekanisme untuk memastikan bahwa publikasi dosen dan mahasiswa kita tidak lagi di jurnal-jurnal yang bermasalah. Terima kasih kepada tim verifikasi jurnal FIB yang sudah bekerja keras menjaga kualitas, terutama Ibu Ekaning Krisnawati yang sigap membalas setiap pertanyaan dan kebutuhan. Di bidang penelitian dan pengabdian pada masyarakat, tahun 2024 FIB mendapatkan hibah riset Unpad 47 judul dengan total dana 2.345.541.300 rupiah. Sementara untuk perolehan hibah riset eksternal dari Kemendikbudristek sebanyak 17 judul dengan total dana sebanyak 1.008.080.000. Perolehan dana penelitian baik hibah internal maupun eksternal pada tahun 2004 mengalami peningkatan dari tahun 2023. Hal ini tidak terlepas dari program yang dilakukan kantor riset, yaitu melakukan pendampingan dalam mempersiapkan proposal yang diajukan. Untuk hibah pengabdian pada masyarakat tahun 2024, FIB mendapatkan hibah sebesar Rp65.650.000 dengan total program pengabdian sebanyak 32 program yang tersebar di 10 desa yang ada di 4 kecamatan, yaitu Kecamatan Jatinangor, Kecamatan Cimanggung, Kecamatan Rancakalong, dan Kecamatan Sumedang Selatan. Model pembangunan desa yang diusung oleh tim PPM FIB dalam program Unpad bermanfaat adalah yang pertama, model pembangunan sosial ekonomi, kedua desa wisata berbasis budaya lokal, ketiga model pembangunan sosial ekonomi desa berbasis pesantren, dan keempat desa literasi budaya. Di bidang kemahasiswaan pada tahun 2024, mahasiswa FIB banyak meraih prestasi, baik di tingkat nasional maupun di tingkat internasional. Pada bidang minat bakat dan penalaran telah diperoleh medali emas sebanyak 15 medali, medali perak 3 medali, dan medali perunggu 14 medali dari berbagai lomba dan bidang prestasi, termasuk sebagai juara favorit kategori presentasi PKM RSH tingkat nasional yang baru saja berlangsung Selamat kepada tim PKM RSH yang diketuai Saudara Syahda Fadliani dari Program Studi Sastra Arab yang beranggotakan dari Program Studi Sastra Arab, Program Studi Sastra Indonesia, dengan didampingi dosen pendamping Dr. Fahmi Lukman M.Hum. Hadirin yang terhormat, pada tahun akademik 2024-2025, Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Padjadjaran menerima mahasiswa sebanyak 852 orang berbagai jenjang dan melalui berbagai jalur, yaitu SNBP, SNBT, SMUP, serta fast track. Jumlah ini sedikit lebih banyak dibandingkan tahun lalu. Meskipun begitu, jumlah ini merupakan jumlah ketiga terbanyak di seluruh Universitas Padjadjaran. Secara keseluruhan, jumlah mahasiswa FIB hingga akhir semester ini adalah 4.125 orang. Dalam bidang akademik, presentasi kelulusan tepat waktu kita sekarang di posisi 65%, yang artinya mengalami peningkatan 5% dari presentasi kelulusan tepat waktu pada tahun sebelumnya. Jumlah mahasiswa yang berprestasi di bidang non-akademik di tingkat nasional maupun internasional sebanyak 33 orang yang terdiri atas prestasi di bidang seni, olahraga, dan penalaran. Selain itu, 4 tim PKM FIB yang beranggotakan 14 orang mahasiswa juga berhasil meraih pendanaan dari Dikti, dan semoga seluruh tim tersebut dapat lolos di PIMNAS 36 yang akan digelar di Unpad akhir bulan November ini dan meraih prestasi terbaik. Hadirin yang saya hormati, dengan jumlah sivitas akademika yang begitu besar, FIB terus bersemangat untuk mewujudkan layanan akademik unggul di segala lini, dosen, tenaga kependidikan, serta berbagai sarana dan prasarana. Dalam 1 tahun terakhir, kita sudah banyak menyelesaikan perbaikan dan pengembangan sarana untuk mendukung proses belajar dan membangun suasana kampus yang hidup. Yang terakhir baru diselesaikan adalah beroperasinya Poeta Coffee Club yang siang ini akan kita resmikan, yang diharapkan bukan saja dapat menghidupkan suasana kampus, melainkan juga menjadi unit usaha untuk menghasilkan pendapatan. Unit usaha kecil-kecilan lain yang juga terus meningkatkan kinerjanya adalah Second Chance, yang sudah dapat ikut meringankan beban mahasiswa, baik dalam memenuhi kebutuhannya dengan lebih murah, maupun untuk membiayai keperluan mahasiswa yang tidak dapat ditangani melalui jalur formal. Juga dalam proses penyelesaian adalah kantin yang berlokasi di belakang pos security. Kantin itu diharapkan dapat menambah tingkat ketercukupan kebutuhan mahasiswa akan makanan yang sehat dan layak dan harga terjangkau. Ibu dan Bapak, revitalisasi lobi gedung dekanat sudah sejak Februari diselesaikan dan sudah berfungsi sebagai bentuk rebranding kampus yang lebih nyaman, termasuk keseluruhan ruang departemen dan koridornya. Kami sudah menyiapkan juga sarana yang lebih representatif untuk BIPA di gedung D. Pembuatan taman dekanat meningkatkan tampilan dan fungsi ruang sidang besar, kecil, dan ruang sidang baru. Ruang-ruang belajar dan diskusi juga diperbanyak di belakang gedung A, yang selalu penuh hingga sore bahkan malam hari. Banyak dari usaha perbaikan ini dilakukan secara mandiri, hasil dari unit usaha akademik kita yaitu Pusat Bahasa. Untuk itu saya ucapkan terima kasih atas kerja keras tim Pusat Bahasa yang kinerjanya semakin membaik dan dampaknya sudah terasa di setiap sudut kampus FIB. Terima kasih kepada Pak Mumu sebagai penanggung jawab, Ibu Vincentia sebagai Komando Pusat Bahasa. Hadirin yang saya hormati, di penghujung pidato ini saya mengajak seluruh sivitas akademika FIB Unpad untuk lebih bekerja keras karena tantangan di masa depan tentu akan lebih berat. Hanya dengan kerjasama, kerja keras, dan kerja cerdas yang dilandasi kebersamaan, kita akan bisa meraih prestasi dan menuju Unpad unggul di tahun 2025. Dalam kesempatan ini dengan kerendahan hati, perkenankan saya untuk menyampaikan ucapan terima kasih dan penghargaan yang sebesar-besarnya kepada para dosen dan tenaga kependidikan yang tahun ini memasuki masa purna bakti. Terima kasih atas pengabdian dan dedikasi dosen dan tendik yang purna bakti tahun ini. Yang pertama Dr. TB Aceh Fahrullah dari Sastra Arab, Dr. Yani Rohmayani dari Sastra Arab, Dr. Pil Niredatning Tias Rinaju Purnomo Wulan dari Sastra Jerman, Dr. Eri Saringendiati Ilmu Sejarah, Bapak Abdul Hamid M.Hum dari Sastra Indonesia, dan tendik Ibu Ani Turkarinah, Bapak Uus Sutardi, Bapak Kusnadi, Ibu Kakah Rumiati, dan Bapak Yuli Hantoro. Hadirin yang terhormat, akhir kata semoga segala amal baik yang telah diberikan oleh Bapak Ibu dan saudara-saudara mendapat balasan yang berlimpah dari Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Saya bersama seluruh jajaran pengelola fakultas memohon maaf yang sebesar-besarnya apabila di dalam mengelola fakultas ini masih banyak kekurangan. Kepada segenap panitia acara Dies Natalies ke-66 FIB Unpad yang dikomandani oleh Bapak Sigit Sugiarto MA, saya mengucapkan terima kasih atas kerja keras dan kerja ikhlasnya hingga Dies Natalies tahun ini dapat berjalan dengan meriah, hangat, dan penuh makna. Ucapan terima kasih juga saya sampaikan kepada mitra kerjasama yang telah berpartisipasi dalam kegiatan Dies Natalies ini. Dirgahayu Fakultas Ilmu Budaya, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, Dekan Profesor Akwarini MH MHum PhD. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Sambutan Rektor Universitas Pajajaran yang akan disampaikan oleh Wakil Rektor Bidang Organisasi dan Perencanaan Universitas Pajajaran, Profesor Dr. Andes Yanyan Muhammadiyani, Mair, PhD.
Welcoming remarks by the Organization and Planning Vice Rector of Universitas Pajajaran, Profesor Dr. Andes Yanyan Muhammadiyani, MAIR, PhD.
Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim, dari doa Allah SWT pada Jum'at Barokah ini kita dapat bersilaturahim dalam rangka tasakur binikmah, yaitu Dies Natalies FIB yang ke-66. Tepuk tangan buat FIB. Sebelumnya izinkan saya di sini menyampaikan rasa hormat saya. Terima kasih pada Prof. Nina di sini sudah hadir, Prof. Kunto, Prof. Reza, Prof. Cece, juga para wakil dekan dan Bu Dekan, semoga cepat sembuh Bu Dekan, dan juga para kepala departemen, Kaprodi di sini, kepada manajer dan Bapak Ibu dosen sekalian, juga para pimpinan anggota Senat Fakultas, dan juga para mahasiswa yang saya cintai, serta juga yang hadir secara Zoom, link. Kalau kita melihat dan kita tasawuf nikmah sebuah Dies, itu adalah sebuah kita melakukan kontemplasi. Kontemplasi terhadap apa saja yang sudah kita lakukan pada masa dulu, apa yang sudah kita lakukan pada saat sekarang, kemudian kita akan move on untuk menuju masa depan yang lebih baik lagi. Nah, untuk hal ini tadi saya mendengar paparan pidato tahunan dari Ibu Dekan, terima kasih. Begitu banyaknya prestasi sudah dicapai, dan saya harapkan bahwa untuk ke depan FIB akan lebih baik lagi. Bapak Ibu sekalian yang saya hormati, para hadirin, Dies Pajajaran sekarang sudah bermetamorfose. Kita akan menginjak pada tiga misi yang harus dicapai oleh pimpinan rektorat 5 tahun ke depan. Yang pertama adalah kita masuk QS 300 dunia. Yang kedua adalah untuk remunerasi itu 3 digit. Insya Allah, kalau uangnya ada. Bagaimana caranya? Yaitu caranya kita harus mencapai 3 triliun tahun 2029. Nah, ini ada bocoran halus ya. Selama 3 minggu ini, pimpinan rektorat dan fakultas sudah rapat. Di mana setiap fakultas kita harapkan berlomba-lomba membuat inovasi-inovasi jadi innova, atau menyampaikan pendapat-pendapat jadi pendapatan. Bagaimana caranya? Mungkin itu fakultas ilmu eksak, dia membuat inovasi akademik. Ilmu sosial, policy oriented studies, menyampaikan pendapat-pendapat jadi pendapatan. Karena kalau tidak demikian, maka tidak akan ada remun 3 digit, karena uang tidak ada. Jadi akhirnya sampai cuan 3 triliun terus kita capaikan. Nah, alhamdulillah minggu kemarin Dekan FIB Bapak ini sudah presentasi bisnis plan, dan Pak Rektor menyampaikan pesan pada saya, tolong katanya digeingkan lagi, panggeing. FIB dipersilahkan oleh Pak Rektor melalui Bu Dekan minggu kemarin untuk membuat pusat bahasa di depan Jonas Foto di Jalan Banda. Nah silakan itu, Anda bayangkan sekarang, di Jonas Foto Jalan Banda itu ada balai motekar di sana. Ketika orang akan berfoto, dia akan kursus dulu bahasa di sana. Ya kan, setelah itu baru dia berfoto bersama. Ada anak SMA, ada mahasiswa, banyak di sana. Dan harus eye catching gitu. Billboardnya menghadap Jonas Foto kalau bisa. Biar kita lihat ke sana. Nah, dipersilakan. Jadi FIB silakan maksimal Senin depan kan harus presentasi lagi displaynya. Karena untuk pemilihan yang akan depan bahwa semua kegiatan akan bertumpu pada bagaimana leadership di tingkat dekanat. Contoh misalkan saja, minggu kemarin saya mendampingi Pak Rektor, kami melakukan sebuah hearing dengan Fakultas Hukum. Di sana katakan bahwa di Fakultas Hukum, mungkin sama dengan FIB, bahwa fokusnya kami bukan di riset, tapi di pembelajaran, di pendidikan, dan di pengabdian. Nah silakan, kalau untuk Remun sekarang tidak harus Anda membuat nilai yang sangat besar untuk publikasi. Anda kalau memang fokusnya pada riset, pendidikan, pengabdian, nanti dekan yang akan memberikan porsi penugasannya. Setiap fakultas ditarget, berapa dia bisa sumbangsi pada rektorat. Nanti uangnya kembali lagi pada kita untuk remunerasi. Jadi untuk 5 tahun ke depan, setiap fakultas dituntut untuk menghasilkan pendapatan. Karena akan kembali ke fakultas. Juga nanti ada sentralisasi pengelolaan keuangan semuanya. Itu yang pertama. Kemudian yang kedua adalah kita pun mengharapkan bahwa kalau Anda lihat di RENIP, Rencana Induk Pengembangan Unpad, 5 tahun ke depan kita masih pada Smart and Green Campus. Nah insya Allah mulai hari ini kan Anda lihat bahwa gerbang lama sudah dibuka untuk uji coba. Nah kita akan membuat Smart and Green Campus. Juga Unpad EduPark itu akan kita kembangkan. Nah silakan di mana misalkan saja FIB bisa berperan. Kalau tidak salah hasil kita hearing ke FIB bahwa minimal sebulan sekali akan ada performance ya dari FIB di depan Alpha X. Silakan. Performance Buddha, Japanese culture, Sundanese culture, it doesn't matter, everyone is fine. Ada jago bahasa Inggris ya. Nah. Silakan itu bisa. Jadi silakan setiap prodi cultural performance di depan Alpha X di mana kita bikin. Sehingga ada learning by doing di sana. Ini adalah inovasi yang kita harapkan bahwa untuk di Unpad sekarang orang itu harus enjoy belajar. Jadi ada namanya work life balance, tidak hanya terus saja di perpustakaan. Kemudian yang ketiga kita harapkan juga bahwa untuk 5 tahun ke depan FIB akan lebih lagi outward looking. Saya nanya tadi kepada Pak Mumu, kita maksudnya naon teh? Maksudnya bahwa kita harus mengakar di merakyat juga unggul di dunia. Nah, jadi mudah-mudahan ini akan tercapai. Karena tak kenal maka tak sayang. Maka ketika ada sebulan sekali cultural performance dari FIB, silakan Anda bisa bikin di depan rektorat Unpad, kemudian di Alpha X, ya kan di mana saja, maka orang akan mengenal, oh ada FIB ternyata di sini. Kita approve bahwa pusat bahasa FIB di Jalan Banda pas depan Jonas Foto, dia eye catching, oh ada pusat bahasa Unpad di sana. Jadi harus tak kenal maka tak sayang. Mungkin kita sudah berkinerja yang sangat bagus, tapi belum dikenal. Karena orang tidak mengenal mana siapa, apa sih keunggulannya. Nah, saya harapkan keunggulan ini dikenal. Kenal dulu baru bisa sayang kan, nggak sayang baru kenal. Nah, kita harapkan untuk ke depan juga akan ada kaderisasi di sini. Bapak Ibu sekalian, kalau kita lihat dari rencana pengembangan Unpad ke depan, untuk 5 tahun ke depan ada 3 direktur baru yang khusus dibuat. Yang pertama direktur pengelolaan bisnis, yang itu di kantor Warik 1. Yang kedua direktur pemasaran di kantor Warik 3. Yang ketiga direktur SDM dan pengembangan tenaga kependidikan khusus tuh. Jadi untuk 5 tahun ke depan Unpad akan fokus pada bisnis dan marketing. Kemudian tendiknya harus digitalize. Tendiknya harus mengenal bagaimana kerja secara sistem menggunakan digital. BIMTEK yang sifatnya IT akan lebih diperbanyak. Nanti akan ada survival of the fittest. Siapa yang kedul gitu, faktor K, dia akan tertinggal. Nah, jadi akan ada. Jadi nanti diharapkan setelah minggu depan akan ada pelantikan warek baru tanggal 6, kemudian tanggal 13 direktur, sekdir, dan kepala kantor dan sebagainya. Hasil asesmen hari kemarin. Nah, kita harapkan untuk 5 tahun ke depan, siapapun juga yang terpilih nanti, bahwa semuanya fokus pada pengelolaan bisnis, pemasaran, dan juga pengembangan tendik di sini. Jadi akan banyak lagi tendik yang akan lebih dilibatkan. Nah, kenapa demikian? Sebab kalau ada 3 direktur ini, kita harus ada produk-produk yang dipasarkan. Jadi di pemasarannya bukan hanya jual untuk mahasiswa, bukan. Pemasaran apa yang bisa kita lakukan pada halayak sehingga akan menghasilkan earning income buat Unpad. Nah, dia ada hal yang baru. Jadi nanti jangan kaget-kaget. Kalau 5 tahun ke depan orang akan banyak berlomba-lomba bagaimana mengejar earning. Karena nanti di tiap fakultas nanti akan pengembangannya, bukan lagi di universitas. Nah, sekali lagi itulah pesan disampaikan oleh Pak Rektor melalui saya, dan kita harapkan bahwa untuk 5 tahun ke depan Unpad akan makin bermanfaat dan barokah buat semuanya. Insya Allah. Sekali lagi atas nama pimpinan Majelis Pelajaran saya ucapkan Dirgahayu FIB yang ke-66, sukses selalu. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Bapak, Ibu, dan tamu undangan yang kami hormati, sebelum penyampaian orasi ilmiah oleh Dr. Ben Murtah, terlebih dahulu kami akan membacakan kurikulum vitae dari beliau.
Dr. Ben Murtagh has been a lecturer at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, London, UK, since 2001. Initially teaching Bahasa Indonesia, literature, and cinema, Ben Murtagh has expanded his teaching interests to include cinema from the Philippines, Singapore, and Malaysia, as well as queer cinema from across Asia. As an Indonesianist in the UK, Ben Murtagh possesses a keen interest in Indonesian culture. In his master's thesis, Ben Murtagh discusses the 19th century British war poem In Betawi, a rhythmic epic about the British invasion of Java in 1811. For his dissertation, Ben Murtagh explores the topic of representations of Britain in traditional Melayu literature. Having published a research paper on gender and sexuality in Indonesian cinema, published by Routledge in 2013, Ben Murtagh is also the managing editor for the Indonesia and the Malay World Journal published by Taylor and Francis, and has experience as the book review editor for the Journal of Southeast Asia Research. A few of the academic positions he has held at SOAS London include Chair of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Head of the Department of South and Southeast Asia, and Head of the School of Languages, Cultures, and Linguistics.
Bapak Ibu yang kami hormati, orasi ilmiah oleh Dr. Ben Murtagh dari SOAS University of London, Inggris.
Academic oration by Dr. Ben Murtagh, Professor at School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, United Kingdom. To Dr. Ben Murtagh, the time is yours.
Selamat siang semuanya. Terima kasih atas kesempatan yang diberikan kepada saya untuk terlibat dalam acara TS Natalies ke-66 Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Pajajaran. Pertama-tama saya ingin menyampaikan ucapan terima kasih kepada Rektor Universitas Pajajaran, Profesor Dr. Arif Syamsul Aksan Kartasasmita, dan Dekan Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Pajajaran, Profesor Akwarini Priyatna, beserta jajarannya atas undangan dan kesempatannya. Sebuah kehormatan bagi saya untuk bisa hadir di tengah-tengah Bapak, Ibu, mahasiswa, dan hadirin sekalian. Meskipun dilakukan secara daring dari London ya. Hadirin yang saya hormati, orasi ilmiah saya pada hari ini berjudul Indonesian Studies from a Global Perspective. Dan ya, minta maaf. Pertama-tama saya harus minta maaf karena orasi saya di dalam bahasa Inggris sebenarnya. Yeah, so it's really heartwarming to be at Universitas Pajajaran today in the presence of such strong academic faculty, students and staff, but also amongst friends and colleagues. I'm very fortunate to have been able to spend some time on campus at the faculty last year, meeting with students and staff, attending meetings, leading a workshop, and also attending a conference there. And I've really enjoyed my engagement with staff and students at that time, and also in various online meetings and in supervisions. I've been thinking about Indonesian films, screen, media and cultures, and I'm incredibly impressed by the broad range of teaching and research which is being conducted and held at the Fakultas Ilmu Budaya. And it's against this backdrop of a thriving research culture that I'm encouraged to say a few words today on this topic of Indonesian studies, thinking about what it is to do Indonesian cultural studies and to ask what the study of Indonesia from the perspective of an outsider might tell us about the field more generally. As we've already heard, I've been involved in Indonesian studies, first as a student and later as a researcher and teacher since 1995, when I first started my undergraduate studies at SOAS, studying for a degree in Indonesian and history. Indeed, I probably already began my studies earlier than that, in 1990, when I first arrived in Kupang one day in April 1990. It was in that year, my first in Indonesia, that I traveled by bus, boat, train, and various forms of transport from Kupang to Banda Aceh. And looking back now, I'm struck by how my approach and my entry to Indonesia was perhaps not the most conventional for scholars from overseas who are interested in the archipelago. I did pass through Jakarta, Bandung, and other parts of Java, but I spent far more time in the outer islands. And indeed, it's notable that I've probably always been more interested in the margins than the center. And that's geographically, socially, and culturally. Now, today, of course, and perhaps inevitably given my focus on film and literature, I spend more time in Java, in Jakarta, Bandung, and other key cities, as my research tends to lead me to national libraries, film archives, cinemas, and film festivals. In so many respects, Jakarta is at the center of Indonesian studies in terms of archives and also the creative industry. But nonetheless, even then, I've always tried to seek out the more marginalized, whether that be in terms of film and literary output, whether it's writers who are not part of the mainstream establishment, or by researching audience responses from marginalized groups. Now, of course, there are many aspects to what we might call Indonesian culture, and the mainstream and the center matters too, commercially, culturally, and strategically, which all merit academic and scholarly attention. Nonetheless, it's often seen to me that in looking away from the center, in looking at the sidelines and on the margins, at the spaces that are made for them and in the cracks in which they push through regardless, we can tell much about the broader society, about the tolerance or otherwise for difference, and the support or not for the less privileged, which overall will tell us as much, which will give us a much more complete picture of the various developments in a particular society and at a particular time. So this brings me to an attempt to define what I think a cultural studies approach to the study of film or literature, or indeed Indonesian studies involves. And here I'm drawing on Forgash in thinking about a cultural studies approach to cinema. So while the study of film aesthetics or cinema, or as an industry, are all valid modes of inquiry, for me, I'm much more interested to examine the ways in which texts, and here I mean films, encode ideological or covertly political messages, and with how audiences may decode and respond to these messages. Thus, a cultural studies approach is often concerned with the way in which contemporary films connect, overtly or not, with collective anxieties and preoccupations, about gender relations and roles, normal and deviant sexualities, demarcation of racial differences, technological change, fears of war, conflict, death, destruction, or ecological disaster. So, for example, a key question for me in recent years has been to think about the changing discourse in Indonesia with respect to the representation of alternative genders and sexualities, and how this is represented on screen, and the spaces that open up or are closed down for such representation. Thus, in my approach to film, and also the approach I encourage my students and colleagues to take in approaching whatever cultural phenomenon they're interested in, it's to stress that cultural studies is not a single approach. It doesn't have a stable set of methods or even of objectives of study. For example, it can analyze a single film text, a series of films, or whole genres. But it can also look at fanzines, blogs, and websites. So oftentimes, we're interested in the text about the text, as we are in the center text itself. And as Forgash reminds us, it can deal with stars and star cults and audience responses to films, documented from various sources. It can and often does cross-fertilize with other approaches to film and popular culture, psychoanalysis and semiotics. But it never comes down solely to these approaches. The interest in ideology and in making explicit the covert meanings in films and text is a recurrent feature, as is the conception of the activity of the agency of the audience as co-producer and negotiator of meaning of the film text, together with its writers, directors, and producers. So, as an academic and researcher, I've always tried to remain mindful of the privilege that comes with the position, and so too of the inherent positions as an academic. As one of the few Indonesians working in London, it became apparent to me soon after my appointment that all sorts of inquiries would come to me from members of the public, inquiries I was often ill-equipped to answer, but that I would do my best to direct to those with more expertise than myself. But more interesting, perhaps, was the opportunity to provide assistance and space to visiting scholars, to help with a venue for a visiting author or filmmaker, and I've been delighted to frequently assist the Indonesian embassy with the screening of Indonesian films, though of course at the same time working to maintain my own ideological and cultural standpoint, which might lead me to propose alternative films or to interpret suggested films in different ways. So too, I've been able to work with film scholars from Indonesia to program screenings and workshops on Indonesian cinema in London, which have in turn fed into publications and academic debates in the broader field. Sometimes these duties and activities will fall outside of the official remit of the university employee in an increasingly marketized environment, but the sense of obligation and of responsibility to the field of study, felt by so many researchers and academics, irrespective of their field, is a strong one, and undoubtedly continues to ensure that despite increasing constraints on our time, we do our best in wider service to our communities and to our fields. And while ever mindful of limits of time and our own mental capacity and resilience, I do commend this approach and hope it may long continue with the next generation of scholars and academics. In student supervision, I've always done what I can to encourage and support students wishing to conduct research topics related to Indonesian culture, however diverse the topic and somewhat far from my own knowledge base. So too in my role as editor of Indonesia and the Malay World, one of the leading journals in the field of Southeast Asian studies. I've done what I can, not only to encourage and support some of the more traditional fields of scholarship in which my department and the journal specialises, so philology, manuscript studies, literature, history, and so on, but also to provide space for scholars and students to publish in less common or sometimes more marginalised fields. For example, eco-criticism, queer studies, new approaches to media study, and the growth of social media. While I have my own specific interests, which I've tried to champion and to highlight, more important probably has been my attempt, probably not always successful, to encourage a field of study which remains open to new ideas, to innovative approaches to scholarship, and one which is not limited by my own sense of the canon or what is right and proper to study. Fundamentally, I'm drawn here to the approach of E. Sedgwick, a leading queer studies scholar, and her arguments on reparative and paranoid reading. Rather than a paranoid reading, which seeks to discover or unearth a definitive truth in a text, and often one we have intentionally set out to find, Sedgwick encourages a reparative reading, a pleasurable and generous approach to the text, which encourages and recognises the possibility of multiple meanings. It seems to me that it is an approach to the field, as well as to individual scholarship, and one which seeks to be genuinely open and generous to what the field and text may surprise us with, rather than the closed and paranoid findings of truths which we suspect to be there from the outset. And this is truly, I guess, an approach that I really encourage us all to at least endeavour to take. Now, my own early research as an Indonesianist was immediately marked by the conviction that Indonesian cultural studies, and in particular the Malay literary tradition, was one which was marked by the global, both in terms of the synthesis of local and global traditions, narratives and images which manifested in the rich manuscript tradition as a result of the meeting of local and non-local cultures in the archipelago, but also as a result of centuries of travel, both physical and within the realm of the imagination, undertaken by writers, pilgrims, merchants, sojourners to lands beyond the archipelago. Students of Indonesian culture will rightfully stress the importance of long and deep immersion in the local cultures of Indonesia, if we're to fully appreciate and comprehend the complexities of local culture and artistic cultures. And rightly so. However, I firmly believe it's also useful to have an ever-watchful eye on the global, on cultures and ideas from beyond the archipelago. There will always be moments when the gaze and engagement with the global pass through peaks and through troughs. But we can think of snapshots from throughout the centuries of Indonesian history when inhabitants of the archipelago looked beyond their islands to the wider world. And whether or not it was the primary intent, cultural impact and cultural change was an important event. These moments of global engagement have perhaps unsurprisingly long marked my own interest in the study of Indonesian culture. And I thought I'd just pick out a couple of key moments, I guess, one from early times and one more recent, as evidence of the key role that the intentional engagement with the global has played throughout Indonesian cultural history, and the strong role that engaging in Indonesian cultural studies from a global perspective can take as we reach and study collaboratively. As I wrote in my 2004 thesis, we know from a wide variety of sources that a multitude of different peoples have been visiting Southeast Asia, and particularly Indonesia and the Malay world, for centuries prior to the formal arrival of Europeans in the 16th century. These visitors came mainly for trade, and historian Anthony Reid remarked that the Europeans who first arrived in Southeast Asia were often astonished by the fabulous wealth and the mysterious herbs that they found there. Conversely, the inhabitants of the region, already being used to a tremendous diversity of people coming to their ports, were not at all astonished at the arrival of Europeans, who represented just another aspect of the diversity to which they were already accustomed. From Reed's comprehensive description of trading patterns in Southeast Asia from 1400 to 1680, a picture develops of a complex trade system, partly contained within the region, but also with Southeast Asian ports acting as entrepot for a far more wide-reaching and extensive Asian trade network. In addition to the mainland hubs, cities in Indonesia and the Malay world, such as Malacca, Patani, Brunei, Pasai, Aceh, Banten, Jepara, Gresik, Makassar, they all served as centres of commerce through which inter- and intra-regional trade and ideas flowed. The two main markets for Southeast Asian goods beyond the region were China and India, and certainly before the Europeans ever arrived, ports throughout the archipelago were well accustomed to receiving traders and ideas from those lands. We note that Malacca, Pasai, Brunei, Gresik, Demak all owed some important part of their prosperity to being used as Chinese trading bases in the 15th century. Malays and Indonesians themselves also visited China. Malacca was the most frequent source of treatment with China in the 15th century. In addition, there were missions from Brunei, Pasai, Pahang, and numerous missions from Java too. From Western Asia, we know that there were frequent visitors to the Malay world and that many of these visitors had formed at least semi-permanent communities in the main trading areas. We well know from Tommy Pires, who reported when Sekera arrived in Malacca in 1509, there were 1,000 Gujarati merchants, 4,000 Persians, Bengalis and Arabs, and a sizable number of Tamils. And furthermore, from the Shah Bandar system of Malacca, we know that there were also Malaccans, Banda, Javanese, Palembang, Tanjung Pura, and people from elsewhere in that important management system of trade within Malacca. The sea routes by which traders came to the Malay world and by which Malays travelled both to India and China are well discussed. From the period of Islamization onwards, individuals began to travel to Arabia for religious reasons, and the Achenese even sent a mission as far as Istanbul in 1564. Also important, but perhaps less well documented, were the overland routes, and from the little extant evidence, we might conjecture that for some time, people from the archipelago had been making journeys across mainland Southeast Asia. And again, Anthony Reed cites the example of the Malay traders who were met by two Dutch officials in Laos in Vientiane in 1642. There was clearly a great deal of knowledge of the world available to some Southeast Asians as a result of these encounters. That such outside knowledge was incorporated, at least selectively, is exemplified by the evidence contained in Albuquerque's letter to Don Manuel I, where he wrote of a map with place names written in Javanese, which he had obtained from a Javanese pilot. This map, from a Javanese pilot, contained information about the Cape of Good Hope, Portugal and the land of Brazil, the Red Sea, the Sea of Persia, the Clove Islands, the various navigations of the Chinese, and the hinterland, and how the kingdoms bordered on each other. So what this brief summary tells us is that for centuries, as well as acting as a crucial crossroad for ideas and trade from across Asia, the people of the archipelago were also travelling in different parts of Asia, adding further still to the complex synthesis of literatures, cultures, religions and ideologies that developed within the archipelago itself. Now, I'm sure none of this is new to you, but it is useful to remind ourselves sometimes of temporal longevity of the global journeys that carriers of Indonesian culture have made. And moving to the opposite end of time, to the 21st century, and to the world of both film and literature, which have been my main fields of research, I've been really struck by the recent developments regarding the place and knowledge of Indonesian culture globally in more recent times. While for many years it was difficult to access Indonesian literature in English translation, for example, and I of course recognize the dangers in equating English with the idea of a global language. Other than some academic translations and the works of a few writers, most notably Pramudia Anantatur or Mokhtar Lubis, it was more or less impossible to access Indonesian literature beyond the archipelago. However, in recent years, there's been an explosion in translation activities, and alongside it, increasing knowledge beyond Indonesia of a much broader body of writers. Undoubtedly, the Indonesian presence at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and soon after that, as the market focus at the London Book Fair in 2019, and the energies around those key events serve as key examples of the importance of soft power and the benefits that such a specific strategy of engagement from government and industry can bring. Writers now, such as Intan Paramadita, have been nominated for various awards internationally. And Eka Kurniawan was the first Indonesian to be nominated, for example, for the Man Booker International Award. If we turn to film also, 20 years ago when I first began to be involved in facilitating the screening of Indonesian films in London at my own university, it was a rare thing indeed to be able to access movies from Indonesia in UK cinemas. International film festival successes were far and few between, and commercial success beyond Indonesia was more or less unheard of. This has also changed in recent years, as increasing numbers of Indonesian film directors and film professionals are gaining a presence in overseas film festivals. And as styles of watching and distribution change, we can note the success of some films such as The Raid, the Pancasila action thriller from 2011, for example. Or in more recent years, the opportunities offered by streaming platforms, meaning that films as diverse as Pengabdi Setan by Joko Anwar, Ali dan Ratu Ratu Queens by Lucky Kuswandi, and the series Gadis Kretek, based on Rati Kumala's novel of the same name, are gaining a presence among international audiences in a way that had been quite unheard of in previous decades. Now, of course, the availability of a book in translation doesn't mean it will be bought. A book bought is not necessarily read. And so too, we cannot be sure that because a film is available on a particular platform, that it's actually being watched. One of the challenges with working with platforms such as Netflix is that they're notoriously difficult to extract viewing figures from. And while we can note the success of Indonesian cultural products, the creative economy, we should also at the same time note the disturbing decline in the study of Indonesian language departments in many traditional centres of Asian studies, in the UK, in my own university, for example, in Australia, the US, Netherlands and elsewhere. It's almost as the world becomes smaller and as perhaps the opportunities for connection become ever closer. And without doubt, the fruits of Indonesia's soft power strategy are truly beginning to bear fruit. We might say that at the same time, the desire to study Indonesian, at least in the West, is at a low ebb. What does this mean for Indonesian studies beyond Indonesia if ever decreasing numbers of people are inclined to learn Indonesian, despite this apparent contradiction given the increase in cultural presence? Now, as I reach the end of my orasi, I want to just think a little bit about what it means to be doing Indonesian cultural studies, studying and researching from a distance and as a non-Indonesian. What have I learned from doing my research and teaching? What lessons and experiences do I think might be useful to share? In my research, I guess I try to be ever mindful of a number of responsibilities. And firstly, I think I soon became aware that the relative freedom that I was given in my university to follow my own research interests meant that I was able to research on topics which might not be so easy to create a space for in other institutions. My work on alternative sexualities and genders in Indonesian cinema has undoubtedly led to a number of advances in the field. I suspect that it would not have been so easy for an academic based in Indonesia to pursue this same topic. Nonetheless, my work drew on a number of studies undertaken by Indonesian undergraduate students, supervised by forward-thinking Indonesian supervisors in institutions from across Indonesia. And so too, I realized that pioneering work had also been done by Indonesian journalists, NGO workers, and fans. In fact, there's been all sorts of pioneering research carried out by dedicated researchers, often from beyond academia. And as with all research, my own stood on the shoulders of those many other studies that had gone before. And the more I could do to network and make links across communities, the more I would gain access to this fascinating research and the interesting people doing it. My own research would benefit, but their work would also gain wider circulation. And just as they shared with me, so I too did my best to share with them and to continue to share with scholars and students who have been subsequently inspired or provoked to develop, refute or expand on my own published research findings. Secondly, I'm also aware that as a researcher, the process of research can often seem extractive, even exploitative. In gathering data, information, and in particular responses from informants, I've much more to gain than to those helping to provide the information. This is, I suspect, a similar scenario for many researchers, but somehow the contrast can appear particularly pronounced for the researcher from overseas. This became very apparent to me when I was conducting focus group research with diverse groups of young Indonesians in Surabaya, generally from less prosperous socioeconomic groups. And I conducted that research at an important NGO in Surabaya, Gaya Nusantara, and without their support, my own research would not have even got off the ground. I was seeking to determine how people from some of the more marginalized identities in Indonesian society might respond to films which purported to reflect the reality of their own lives. So basically, I was doing audience studies, an approach to Indonesian cultural studies which put equal weight on the potential meaning-making of the audiences as it did the researcher's own response to a particular film. Going back to Sedgwick, I was trying to do a reparative reading rather than a paranoid one. I was trying to read for the surprise of the meanings one might find rather than the ones I expected to find. Now, as Douglas Harper has noted in response to his elicitation work with an American farmer, by using images, the respondent came to see his world from a new perspective and to realize how little of it the researcher understood. It became apparent for the person who was being researched that he had much to teach the researcher. That's one of the most inspiring benefits of this method of investigation, the focus group, and perhaps the reason that most of my research participants attended the full series of discussions was that, as Gose and Lineback have noted, both the researcher and the research subject may simultaneously obtain insights and understandings of particular social situations during the process of research. Thus, the focus group, perhaps more than many other types of research, is inevitably collaborative in nature. It's certainly my contention that focus groups may go some way to addressing the unequal power relationship between researcher and research subjects. Though, of course, it's recognized that the responsibility for interpretation and analysis remain with the researcher. Crucial here is the involvement of the research subjects in the planning of the research itself, in obtaining their consent as participants, but also listening to participants so that they too can benefit from the process of the research itself and potentially help to direct the impact of some of the findings. So in conclusion, I'm not sure that my perspective is any more global or otherwise than any other researcher working on Indonesian cultural studies. Though, as a British male white researcher, I am privileged to have been enjoying and delighted by Indonesian film and literature since I began my academic studies almost 30 years ago. I'm more aware than ever of the collaborative nature of Indonesian cultural studies. Collaboration between researcher and subject, between teacher and student, between researcher and audience, and between publisher and writer. And perhaps most importantly, of collaboration across and between institutions. And so it's on this note I close by recording my delight at being able to collaborate and share some ideas today with colleagues and students of Fakultas Ilmu Budaya at Universitas Padjadjaran. So I return to Indonesian to say demikianlah orasi ilmiah saya. Terima kasih atas perhatian. Selamat Dies Natalies ke-66 Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Unpad, rampak dina lampa, nyurut dina laku. Selamat pulang jalan.
Penyampaian piagam penghargaan kepada Dr. Ben Murtag, kepada Dekan Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Padjadjaran, kami mohon untuk berkenan menyerahkan piagam penghargaan.
We kindly request the pleasure of the Dean of the Faculty of Cultural Sciences to present a token of appreciation to Dr. Ben Murtag.
Hello. Okay. Dr. Pak Ben, are you still there?
Yes, I am still here. Yeah, masih di sini.
Okay. So on behalf of the faculty, I would like again to thank you for your very I have to look at the camera. So thank you for your very insightful presentation, and I remember how you were coaching our students doing film studies, and how you came up with this, you making sure that the sensitivity of class, gender, sexuality, and geographical domains should play an important roles in doing the research. So I think that's very important, and I do appreciate and kind of happy that you actually spell it out, your privilege of being male, white, UK scholar, because that is also something I think we are working on. So again, we are deeply humbled by your kind contribution, and I believe if you would allow us, would you let us have your presentation? We will translate that into Bahasa Indonesia for the reference of the students and lecturers of the faculty. Will that be all right?
Yes, of course it will.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Pak Ben, on behalf of Faculty of Cultural Sciences, I would like to present a certificate of contribution at the Faculty of Cultural Sciences anniversary, the 66th anniversary. Thank you again. I would like to invite everyone to join with me to give applause for Pak Ben. Udah? Pak Ben, itu certificate of appreciation-nya. Thank you again, and I'm sure we will meet again very soon. Have a chat, take a tea somewhere in Lembang, remember?
Ya, terima kasih banyak. Ya, sampai jumpa lagi. Mudah-mudahan tahun depan.
Ya, terima kasih. Tunggu Pak Ben. Terima kasih. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Oke, baik. Bapak, Ibu, dan tamu undangan yang kami hormati, dengan demikian selesailah puncak peringatan Dies Natalies ke-66 Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Padjadjaran dengan acara utama orasi ilmiah oleh Dr. Ben Murtag.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ben Murtag's oration concludes the main event marking the commemoration and celebration of the 66th anniversary of the Faculty of Cultural Sciences of Universitas Padjadjaran.
Bagi Sivitas Akademika Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Padjadjaran, kami mohon untuk tidak pulang dulu karena setelah jeda acara akan dilanjutkan dengan acara hiburan dan pembagian hadiah.
We kindly request faculty members, students, and audience to remain in this area as we will proceed with many more celebratory events, including the presentation of prizes for winners immediately after the break.
Kami ucapkan terima kasih kepada mitra kerjasama yang telah mendukung kegiatan Dies Natalies ke-66 Fakultas Ilmu Budaya Universitas Padjadjaran, diantaranya Bank Syariah Indonesia, Bank Rakyat Indonesia, dan Syam Optik.
We would like to extend our deepest gratitude and appreciation to our partners, Bank Syariah Indonesia, Bank Rakyat Indonesia, and Syam Optik for having supported and sponsored the series of events celebrating the 66th anniversary of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Universitas Padjadjaran.
Setelah ini, kami undang Bapak Ibu untuk mengikuti peresmian Cafe Poeta di Dekanat.
Esteemed audience, we also invite you to attend the inauguration ceremony at the Faculty of Cultural Sciences' new Coffee Corner Poeta located at the Dean's Building.
Atas perhatian dan kehadiran Bapak Ibu dan tamu undangan, kami ucapkan terima kasih.
Distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, that marks the end of our event for today. We sincerely thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Baik, Bapak Ibu, seperti yang sudah disampaikan, kami undang untuk ke dekanat. Mangga Prof Reja, ya di sana juga ayah kape, Prof, ayah kopi. Nah, mangga Prof Kunto, ya. Dan acara pembagian hadiah, door prize dan lain-lain akan dilanjutkan di depan dekanat. Untuk itu, bagi seluruh sivitas akademika yang telah mengisi presensi, kami silahkan untuk langsung menuju ke dekanat.